The Compromise of 1850 had put off the question of slavery in the territories for a few years, but the lure of the West was irresistible. By 1854, Americans were clamoring for new lands to be opened for settlement, and Kansas and Nebraska were first in line. With his Kansas-Nebraska Act, Stephen Douglas, who had ultimately engineered the passage of the Compromise of 1850, became the unwitting engineer of its collapse. Douglas was a tireless advocate of Western expansion. As chairman of the Senate Committee on Territories, he was eager to organize the Nebraska Territory so that it could be opened for settlement. A man of small stature and enormous ambition, Douglas was nicknamed the Little Giant.
He thinks he can bestride this continent with one foot on the shore of the Atlantic, the other on the Pacific. But he can't do it. He can't do it. His legs are too short.
In the 1850s, westward expansion was a dream shared by many Americans. Northerners of the free soil, free labor persuasion wanted Western lands open to homesteaders. Southerners were looking for opportunities to expand the dominion of slavery in the Western territories. Neither North nor South was concerned about the Indian lands that lay in their path.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act, in effect, opened up this plains area to settlement by farmers and whoever, which meant they were encroaching on Indian lands. So what had to be done with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a renegotiation of all of the treaties, which was done in the latter 1850s, pushing the Indians and the reservations north to what are now the Dakotas and south into what is now Oklahoma.
Douglas was not concerned with the sovereignty of the Indian nations and regarded them as little more than an obstacle to progress. But he believed in the popular sovereignty of white settlers. To this end, he drafted a bill which would organize two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and allow the question of slavery in each territory to be decided by its inhabitants.
He was dedicated or committed to this notion of popular sovereignty. He felt that was the only way to treat the slavery issue. Now, he could take that attitude and still maintain a kind of anti-slavery view because he knew that slaveholders were not the ones who are migrating to Kansas, Nebraska, Utah, New Mexico, and so forth. The people who were migrating came from the free states. Slave owners were not uprooting their plantations and moving them to Kansas. And he also thought that popular sovereignty was a middle ground. He felt it would bring peace to the two sections. He was very wrong about that.
The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act provoked a storm of reaction across the country. As the man responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Stephen Douglas was vilified.
Especially the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused a vicious opposition, first of all in Congress, where Douglas was charged with all kinds of heinous things, down on his knees before the slave power and all of this sort of thing. And Douglas returned to Chicago after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the summer of 1854, and he said when he got to Chicago he could have traveled by the light of his burning effigies all the way by train from Washington to Chicago.
Once the bill was passed, the battle over slavery in the territories moved from the relatively controlled halls of Congress to the open ground of Kansas.
We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas, and God give victory to the side which is stronger in numbers as it is in right.
While the North was sending large numbers of immigrants to Kansas, the South was gathering its forces in Missouri. At the first election, several thousand pro-slavery men crossed the border into Kansas and voted. The outcome of the election was overwhelmingly pro-slavery, but at least 60% of the votes were illegal. Free Staters elected a government of their own, which established itself in the city of Lawrence, Kansas. In response, a territorial court judge sent a federal marshal with the posse to arrest the Free State leaders for treason. The posse degenerated into a mob, and the town of Lawrence was sacked, its buildings burned, its homes looted, and its inhabitants terrorized. 3 days later, John Brown, a Northern abolitionist, took vengeance for the sack of Lawrence. Estimating that 5 anti-slavery settlers had been killed thus far in Kansas, he selected 5 pro-slavery men at random from a settlement at Pottawatomie Creek and had them executed by his small band of followers. While border ruffians and bushwhackers fought it out in bleeding Kansas, senators and congressmen fought a war of words in Washington, but even there the rhetoric brought bloodshed. After Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gave an anti-slavery speech, a representative from South Carolina named Preston Brooks beat him senseless with a cane on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Southerners congratulated Brooks by sending him more canes. Politics in Kansas became more complicated as the territory prepared to apply for statehood. Free Soilers and Republicans abstained from some elections, while pro-slavery Democrats abstained from others, and both sides stuffed ballot boxes. As delegates to a constitutional convention were preparing a constitution that legalized slavery, voters in the election of 1857 elected an anti-slavery legislature.
The Lecompton Constitution was the effort on the part of the slave power to bring Kansas into the Union as a slave state while they still could, while the population was still in flux. And Douglas saw that as such a travesty, a blow against popular sovereignty, that although it was passed with and promoted by a Democratic president and by Democratic leaders from the South, Douglas opposed the Lecompton Constitution.
Congress refused to ratify the Lecompton Constitution and returned it to the voters. This time, with election controls in place, the Free Soilers defeated it. Stephen Douglas was a man ensnared in his own web. Popular sovereignty had failed to maintain the peace in Kansas. In fact, it had provoked a guerrilla war and delayed statehood for years. More importantly, the Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed any pretense of harmony between the North and South. The gloves were off, and they would not be put back on again.
We regard every man who does not boldly declare that he believes African slavery to be a social, moral, and political blessing as an enemy to the institutions of the South.
The South, I must say it, is the enemy of the North. She is the enemy of our material welfare and our spiritual development. Her success is our ruin.